Welcome to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and spirituality. My name is Andy. I hope you enjoy this show. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. This is a transmission on the energies of Neptune in Aries. This is a description of the energies in a general sense. Please remember to take what resonates and leave the rest. Right? I'm speaking to the general energies. It's not going to apply to every person. And even when I'm speaking to the collective energies, that's not going to apply to every part of the world. So please stay connected to your own intuition, your own knowing, and allow this merely to help you connect with that more deeply. There are always positive manifestations of even the more difficult transits in astrology. So my hope is by describing the possibilities that gives us a little more agency as to how we work with these energies. The more we work with the energies with intention and awareness, the less that they have to show up from the outside and in potentially difficult ways. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. I hope you enjoy the recording. I would like to speak to some of the big energetic shifts that are taking place this year, 2025, and that will define some of the energetic themes we'll be working with for several years, even in some cases, several decades. So this year is a year where there are some big shifts taking place. Astrologically speaking, the outer planets, which move more slowly, define these longer term energies. And within a year, we have every outer planet changing sign. And that's if we include Pluto in late 2024, finally moving into Aquarius. And then in 2025, we have Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, all changing signs as well. And today I want to speak specifically to Neptune. Neptune shifting from Pisces into Aries. So Neptune was in Pisces from 2011, 2012. So it went first into Pisces in 2011 and then for a few months back into Aquarius and then in 2012 into Pisces where it stayed for over a decade. This year, Neptune shifted into Aries on March 30th, 2025. And it will move back into Pisces for a few months from October 22nd until January 26th, 2026. And then it'll stay in Aries all the way up until 2038. And then, as it often does, it's going to move back from Taurus into Aries for a few months and then fully will be in Taurus as of 2039. So we have more than a decade of Neptune in Aries. Now to add to this picture, we also have Saturn with Neptune in Aries. Saturn and Neptune will be very close to conjunct July 2025, but the conjunction isn't exact until February 20th, 2026. Okay, so I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for the structure, for the dates and the timing. And now let's get into what it means. So the outer planets that, weren't known to the ancient astrologers that, required a telescope and, modern science in order to be identified, often the kind of cultural currents at the time of their discovery are correlated with their significance. So Neptune was discovered in 1846. And that was the very same year that anesthesia started to be used during surgery. It was the year that there was the first public demonstration of anesthesia. So there were other forms of anesthetics before that, but it was sort of used in ancient history, but kind of fell out of use over the years and then was in a way rediscovered. And there is a relationship between anesthesia and Neptune. Also, in this period of history, there was a real interest in psychoactive substances in general, particularly in opiates. And there was a real interest at the time as well in spirituality, right? So a cultural shift away from religion and into exploring different spiritual systems. You could even say that this period marked the beginnings of the New Age. This period saw a response or reaction to the Enlightenment through Romanticism and Impressionism. Romanticism kind of peaked around this time and Impressionism was in full force. So moving away from realism and accuracy and into a more romantic and imaginative and emotion-based form of art. And all of these themes are connected in some way with Neptune. Neptune can be tied to escape in all its many forms. It can be tied to substances, to addiction, to numbing, to blurring the boundaries, softening the edges, to the otherworldly, to what is not of this world, whether that's through escaping the world somehow, through altering it, through exploring spirituality, through transcendence. It can be related to delusion and illusion and deception. There's a blurring of truth in a way, or at least consensus reality. On a more positive note, Neptune can be related to unity consciousness, to true love, pure love, transcendental love, universal love, to transcendence in general in all its many forms. So transcending boundaries, transcending the ego. There's often a sort of arc with Neptune of the ideal, the dream, the fantasy, and then over time coming to understand that it's not realistic, that there is a fantasy aspect to the fantasy, maybe even a delusion tied to it. And then there can be a sort of disillusionment. And the potential of being disillusioned is to come into a more realistic relationship to the potential of Neptune, to unconditional love and what that actually takes, or to striving for our ideals, but recognizing that they are only ideals, that they may not show up exactly in that form in reality. There can be an arc of coming to understand that the various ways we try to escape this reality that aren't so healthy, whether through substances or alcohol or dissociation, or through, and of course this is especially relevant in these times, through screens, through games, through virtual reality. So virtual reality is very much signified by Neptune. So there can be coming into a better relationship with the Neptunian principle and finding other means of relating to what's beyond this reality. Right? In planetary terms, to what's beyond Saturn, right? What's beyond the visible planets, what's beyond the visible world, what's beyond our 3D reality. It is murky, right? It's not clear. We don't have easy access to what is beyond. And yet, there certainly seems to be something that is beyond, right? Beyond what we can see and touch. So at best, Neptune can also be mystical. It can be what we receive through all the many disciplines and practices of mystical spirituality. So Neptune doesn't signify the practices themselves, but it does signify the experience that we might receive through those practices. The feeling of touching God or connecting with what is beyond, connecting with the divine. And often people are drawn to various substances in an attempt, conscious or unconscious, to find that, right? To find union. Now, in Pisces for over the last decade, right? Pisces is the sign that is most similar to Neptune. So it carries similar themes. Right? Pisces is known as being poetic, imaginative, mystical, dreamy. The energy of Pisces is very skilled at understanding the interconnections between all the parts. It's attuned to wholeness. And in that way, sometimes it has a difficulty with expressing itself or putting its insights into language, because Pisces is not logical, linear, clear, decisive. And yet at best, it can express itself through art, through imagery, through poetry, through music. So one of the themes that was really prominent during this period since 2011, 2012, since Neptune was in Pisces, is the expansion of the use of psychedelics, particularly in more mainstream or sanctioned spaces. So, for instance, with the organization MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which was born earlier, but which really took off in the last decade. But we've also seen a much more widespread use of other plant medicines in ceremonial context. And we can see how there was a sort of arc of progression through the ideal of what these technologies might offer and the hope of bringing it into mainstream science and medicine, but also the potential disillusionment of what happens when these become more mainstream, right? Of what happens when plant medicine starts to be taken up by so many more people, and sometimes in beautiful ways, but sometimes with a lack of discernment or education or context, right? Sometimes in dangerous ways, in unskillful ways, and in a sort of parallel way with the scientific trials and the medicalization of psychedelics, there's the question of what is lost when we work with these medicines in that kind of context. And, of course, I'm drawing broad strokes on these topics that are very complex and nuanced and detailed, and there are so many beautiful things that have come from these currents. But my point is just to speak to this arc of the ideal, right, the hope, And then understanding the shadow aspects of putting too much faith, being overly idealistic, and then a sort of disillusionment that can happen over the course of time. And then hopefully coming into a more realistic and right relationship with whatever it is. So I brought that in just as a quick little illustration of one of the ways in which Neptune can work. So that now that Neptune is in the sign of Aries, we might understand potential similar arcs. So Aries, what does Aries signify? It's the first sign, right? A fire sign. So it's about beginnings, initiations, impulse, instinct, action, initiative, drive, passion. Sometimes it can be rash. Sometimes it can be too quick or begin before it's ready. There's a beautiful risk-taking ability with Aries, but, that can go in positive or less positive ways. Sometimes there's a violent impulse with the energy of Aries. There's always a need to work with anger when Aries is involved, to come into a right relationship with anger. Right? So the Aries energy can't avoid anger, can't repress it. And yet, because anger has been so repressed over the history of humanity, most of us have to work a little bit to relate to it in a good way, where we're not repressing it, but we're also not just unconsciously acting out on it. So anger is a theme. Violence is a theme. How we take action, how we take initiative, what we stand up for, and who, and how. Aries also is about identity and understanding the self, understanding who we are. So, we might expect a shift in identity politics or in how we relate to identity. And Aries also is connected with masculinity, right? And whenever I speak about gender, I'm always speaking about the energies that are within all of us. We all have a masculine aspect, just as we all have all the signs in our astrology chart, just in different degrees, in different ways, in different places. Will and willpower and right use of will are also really important themes with Aries. So what might it mean with Neptune here? So think of all these Aries themes under the influence of the slow movement of this planet that speaks to ideals, the dream, the fantasy, the delusion, the disillusionment, and then finally the mystical right relationship. And this is, of course, if we actually go through the evolutionary process, right, which takes awareness and effort and intention. It's always possible to get stuck, right, or to not take responsibility for our own relationship with these energies, to stay in the energy of fantasy or escapism or delusion. And in astrology, we often see the more negative or more shadow manifestations of energy on a collective level for a couple of reasons. One is because we usually hear about the most difficult things going on, right? It doesn't make the news when people are evolving or expressing energies wisely. So there is a biased selection process in terms of what news we receive of the collective. And the second reason is the collective is probably as a whole less conscious than you as an individual, as someone who's listening to this recording, right? That itself is also a biased selection process. You almost certainly have more awareness, more intention, more desire to evolve and to do that work than the average person out there. So we often see the worst potentials of astrology play out in really dramatic ways in the collective. But as an individual, we have a lot more say over how we relate to these potentials. A lot more ability to lean into the positive potentials on offer. So I think it's helpful to hold that, to keep that in mind, because sometimes when we're talking about the potentials of various energies, it can sound scary, right? We're talking about the worst possibilities and the best ones, and it's like, well, how do I lean into the best ones? So intention is so important. Set an intention for your day, for your year, for this transit. So be intentional in how you want to work with these energies. And that in itself goes such a long way towards manifesting the more positive potentials, and through moving through or evolving through or transforming any potential shadow aspects that may still be in your being. So I think if fear comes up when we're working with divinatory methods, it's often a sign that we're relating to that tool or process in the wrong way. Like it's not, we're not clear-headed. We're not in right relationship if we're relating to it from fear. And that's not to say fear doesn't come up from time to time. It's just to say don't trust yourself when you're in that state of fear. Right? So my purpose here isn't to bring up fear. It's to empower us so that we can work with these transits with more awareness, more intention, so that we can evolve through them. Because there's always, always, always an opportunity for evolution. So, Neptune in Aries. On one level, there's a real opportunity for us to dissolve our previous identity, our sense of who we thought we were, and not to come into a sort of nothingness or egolessness, which, there may be spiritual moments of egolessness, of transcendence, but as psychological beings, ego is actually necessary. We need to have some sense of identity, some sense of who we are as beings separate from other beings. Even if on a spiritual level, ultimately, yes, we are all connected. You could even say we all are one. But we also are individuals. So what I'm speaking to is not an utter, complete transcendence of ego. Yet there is an incredible opportunity for us to shift in our identity, to shed the layers of who we thought we were, which, might be useful for a time. And maybe now is a time when many of us are coming to see that many of the ways in which we've defined ourselves or understood ourselves are no longer serving us. And, we can certainly see this happening in the collective when, the entire world order is shifting and different nations are just beginning, perhaps, to question their own sense of identity when there does seem to be more of a potential these days and over the next decade for boundaries to be mutable, right? To change. The world map may look different after this transit, right? As individual nation identities are overcome and transcended and then reformed. Right? So there's this parallel always between the individual and the collective process. And in this case, the process of dissolving our ego identity, our boundaries, in order that it can be reformed in a different way. And just as Neptune is the dream in the sense that it may not be realistic, it's also at best the dream in the sense of our intention or our desire or what we're manifesting or, the ideals we hold. Like, there is a positive aspect to the dream. So a question you might hold in your heart and just start to pay attention to: what aspects of your identity are you ready to shed? In what ways have you been holding yourself too separate from others? Culturally, I suspect that there will be a sort of reaction against identity politics in the following way. It's useful and important to understand our positionality, right? Who we are in relationship to others. And, there was a use to identity in this sense of, understanding who we are in that way. But like everything else, often these things are taken to an extreme. And when someone is so identified with this list of traits, whatever it is, right? Race, class, gender, etc., it can be very stifling after a time. At first it might be very liberating. We might find belonging. We might find a sense of self. But if it really becomes this rigid structure of this is who I am, not only are we limited by those definitions, but on a spiritual level, we come to be identified with material features of reality, which can keep us from identifying with our soul or true self. Who we really are as a soul isn't any of those things. It's not anything we can specify or define. Who we really are as a soul is vast. It's infinite. It's indefinable. It's ineffable. And yes, on a material, practical level, we need to be able to describe who we are and understand who we are. That's not the issue. The issue is when we mistake that for the permanent truth, for all there is to it. Right? So this transit gives us the opportunity to come into a more expansive understanding of who we truly are. And as things go in the collective, we might see first a sort of pendulum swing of people going very far in this direction in reaction to identity politics. But as individuals, of course, we always are able to relate to these themes in our own way, right? In a more mature way than what we see in the collective. There is the shadow potential of, on a collective level, the attempt to almost usurp this energy in order to deny individuality or difference, right? So there might be kind of a political or cultural manifestation of a sort of false spirituality, sometimes called the false light, right? Which in this case might be, we are all one, unity, right? And there's a truth to unity. There's a truth to we are all one, but we have to not lose the practical truth of, and we are all different and unique, and we're individuals, right? So an immature understanding of this energy would want to take away individuality, individuation, free will, and call that unity. But true unity can only come about through honoring and appreciating difference, uniqueness, freedom, individuality. There's always a paradoxical quality to spirituality, although it's not a real paradox because we don't want to conflate levels of reality. There's the practical material level of reality, And there's the spiritual level of reality where, yes, everything is all one. We are all one, which you might understand as God, as consciousness, has come into form as all of us, right? All these individual perspectives. Ultimately, we are all of the same thing. We are all God. Even our awareness, it's all one awareness. It's just looking out of all these different eyes from all these different perspectives with all these different personal histories and stories. So both are true. So sometimes I get a little nervous when I hear people talking about unity. That's one of those words that's been, becoming more and more prevalent. And I think it's ripe for political abuse. The concept of unity could really be misused against us. And yet it's important not to throw it away, right? So there's an important mystical truth there we don't want to lose. Now, another really important theme is violence, war, and peace. War and peace. And as Neptune is the potential for the illusory fantasy, I think we are already seeing a real valorization of violence. And we are met with this question of, when faced with the most despicable, horrendous, unconscionable, violent acts, what shall we do? Who shall we be? How do we resist or fight that? Right? What is the right relationship to violence, actually? Most of what's been called peace in human history has not been that. Most of what's been called peace is merely stability. Stability which often feeds on violence, right? Violence in other parts of the world, or an exploitative, violent class structure, the military-industrial complex feeding the economy, right? What's basically slave labor. So, even in parts of the world in recent history that have been quote-unquote peaceful, that's not true peace. That's just stability. It's the illusion of peace. And so even the very concept of peace can be triggering to some people who only know it in that context, right? Who only know peace in quotations, right? What political leaders might call peace, but which really is a sort of status quo that relies on violence. Does that mean that peace isn't possible, that there is no such thing as peace? Does it mean that we should throw out the concept altogether, that we should simply accept violence? And is peace even possible or feasible or realistic when we're faced with violent forces? Is pacifism actually, possible or advisable? There's been a lot of scholarship on these themes in the last several decades. And, famously, Franz Fanon, who has written about how for oppressed people, it's really unjust to expect them not to be violent, right? For people who are faced with violence, what is an appropriate response? You can try peaceful interventions, but if they don't work, what then? Is violence sometimes necessary? Is it sometimes justified? And I think if we're truly compassionate, if we're really able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, I don't know that it's fair to expect people who are themselves being faced with violence to not themselves ever use violence. And yet, I think we're seeing a real shift in how these ideas are related to. Because for a long time, these ideas were approached with a great deal of care. And activist groups, revolutionary leaders, sometimes famously would use a great deal of discernment and strategy as to when and how to use violence. For a long time, most people would consider, how can we achieve our goals while using the least amount of violence? If we decide violence is necessary strategically in order to fight for freedom, right, in order to overcome oppression, if we decide that some kind of violent action is necessary, how can we do so in a way that hurts as few people as possible, or that doesn't hurt civilians, that doesn't hurt children, that's targeted and precise and discerning? I think it's important that we sift through these ideas like this, because I think what's idealistic here is to assume that violence is never needed or necessary, that pacifism is truly possible, right? And if we're someone who isn't faced with direct violence, it's actually kind of cruel to point to people who are in the most dire circumstances, who are oppressed, who are faced with violence every day, and tell them that they should be pacifists, right? That's actually quite cruel. And yet, simply accepting violence as across the board to be necessary and good even is also idealistic and undiscerning and cruel. And I think we are already seeing this kind of lack of discernment as we're faced with these despicable acts of incredible violence by those who hold a great deal of power against those who don't. The response or the reaction of many is the idealistic acceptance and valorization of violence across the board as the necessary and good and appropriate response, without much consideration of how and when and who and where, right? And I'm painting broad strokes, of course. Obviously, there are many people who are grappling with these things in a critical way. There's a bit of this trend surfacing in the culture at large. And I think this is also importantly in the context of this culture of a real misunderstanding of triggers, right? There's even been a sort of valorization of triggers as, people acting out on their triggers and calling that right action, calling that appropriate. A trigger is always a sign that there's something to be healed. There's always an opportunity when we're triggered, especially if we have the tools and the resources and the support in order to go into that trigger, to understand it, to work on healing the trauma that caused it. Because when we simply act out on our triggers, we almost always cause more pain. We create more trauma in the world for other people. Hurt people, right? So we are learning how to heal and to respond rather than to react, rather than to act out, rather than to spread our pain around, rather than to hurt people because we ourselves are hurting. I've seen a lot of people in the last few years, really intelligent, thoughtful people, uncritically supporting undiscerning acts of violence as an attempt at compassion, social justice, right action, unknowingly creating more harm, more violence, more trauma. Because when we put our energy behind uncritically violent acts, even if we aren't the one acting. We're supporting that energy. We're supporting that process. We're creating more of that in the world. And so I haven't spoken too much yet about Saturn. But Saturn, too, in the sign of Aries and conjunct to Neptune, and even if the exact conjunction isn't until early 2026, they are within a few degrees. So they are more or less conjunct already, and they will be for a while. And Saturn does give us the possibility of discernment in critical thought, along with Neptune. I think we have to be careful when there are these huge cultural movements and energies. It's so easy to get swept up into that. And yet, most of the time, we are unknowingly supporting violence, harm, unconsciousness, fear. Right? It's very rare that there are these huge emotional currents of the collective that are conscious and aware and discerning. Usually that's work we have to do on our own. And even if not, because of course there are beautiful communities and there is an incredible awakening taking place across the earth as well. But those kind of movements don't usually show up in the same way. It's not usually this like powerful cultural current that we can get swept up in. It's a different kind of energy. It requires more intention and consciousness to be part of that, to be part of those currents. So I won't be surprised if over the course of Neptune's transit through Aries, which, remember, goes until 2038 or 2039. So I won't be surprised if on a collective level we see first a valorization of violence, the immature, undiscerning acceptance of violence across the board, only to be disillusioned by that as time goes on, to see what that creates. To see that that only creates more violence, more harm, more trauma, more fear. And again, even if you're not the one doing the violent act, if you're merely putting your energy behind it, I think an interesting archetype here is Paul Atreides, right, from Dune. I think it's really interesting that the first two movies were released in the last several years, which cover the first book, right? The first book in the Dune series. And the third movie isn't set to come out for some time now, until I think after 2030. And I don't think this is exactly a spoiler. I'm saying that in case you're, very pure about spoilers and really, don't want to hear anything about what happens after the first two films, right after the first book. But I think this is sort of general enough that it won't spoil anything. To say that, in what's come out in the movie version so far, right, and what happens in the first book, Paul Atreides is a very sort of sympathetic figure that comes to lead a violent, what would you call it? Insurrection, an attack on the regime, which there are so many sympathetic parallels to that in our culture right now, right? Siding with the underdog and supporting them. And yet, and this is the kind of not quite a spoiler, later in the story, he becomes aware of what he has started, that he has begun a massive war that spreads throughout the entire cosmos, and that millions upon millions upon millions of people die and suffer. And he becomes very ambivalent about what he's been involved in. And so what appears first to be the hero, right, what in the zeitgeist is seen as the hero right now, it's not so clear. it's more confused. It's very Neptunian, actually, this theme. It's murky. It's confused. Violence is not something we ought to relate to from this idealistic place of, oh, well, it's violence against the oppressor, therefore, obviously it's always right and good and true. Actually, it's much more murky, much more confused, much more unclear. And again, to be clear, I am not suggesting that there is no place for violence. I'm not calling for, what would be the counter ideal of pacifism. I am calling for discernment. I'm calling for pause. How about we take a step back and consider what we're supporting before we get swept up in these unconscious cultural currents? So is peace possible? I think what it will take is a great deal of turning inward and healing. So easy to point fingers, right, and blame everyone else, especially in times where we're witnessing such disgusting atrocities unfolding. Obviously, I didn't cause that, right? You didn't cause that. But what are the subtle, tiny ways in which you and I create harm or violence or perpetuate those cycles? The more that more of us can turn inward and do that kind of difficult healing work, the more violence will become unnecessary, the more peace may be actually possible. So one of the highest potentials for Neptune in Aries is to turn that Neptunian gaze inwards, to reflect on the self, right? Aries, selfhood, identity, individuality, to take responsibility for ourself and our actions and our impulses. So I think the way we can work towards greater peace in our lives and in the world is through the process of taking stock, of really getting very honest and real about our own actions and where we have caused harm. It probably won't be so obvious, right, as what happens in the collective. It might be small ways in which we cause harm. But as Neptune is very mystical and transcends individuality, we might also consider in a broader way, on a soul level, how we might have caused harm in past lives or parallel lives, right? To stop pointing fingers and start turning within and taking responsibility for ourselves and really facing ourselves, right? Aries also holds the potential for incredible courage, right? That's one of the beautiful aspects of Aries. And it takes incredible courage to turn within, to take responsibility for ourselves and our actions, to face the ways in which we've caused harm. It's really hard to face that. And as we do, we are bound to face guilt, right? The feeling of guilt, emotional sense of we've done something wrong. Now, I want to distinguish between guilt and shame. Shame is never valid, in my view. It never is authentic. It never comes from our higher self. I believe shame is always a cultural artifact, a weaponized emotion, a way in which we've been taught to stay small and hate ourselves, right? And fall into line and do as we're told and fear our own sexuality and our own power and our own selfhood. And even our own relationship with God, with the divine. Shame is something we heal from, something we release. And yes, we want to release guilt too. But, sometimes I encounter people who, are doing healing work and have this intention to release guilt. We want to release guilt. And yes, guilt is something we want to release, but guilt itself isn't negative. And the way in which to release it is to go into it and to go through a process. So most of us tend to repress guilt because it's so uncomfortable, it's so difficult to feel, and it's so difficult to do the work of acknowledging where we've done wrong. But if we have the courage to face the ways in which we might feel guilty, if we have the courage to actually feel that emotion, it's through feeling it, it's through moving through it, right? That guilt functions as it's meant to, right? It's meant to bring us to face ourselves, to really own up to what we've done, right? To face it, to say, oh my God, I did that. I see it. I'm no longer repressing it. I see it. I acknowledge what I've done. I acknowledge that I've caused harm. And I'm so sorry, right? Without the emotion of guilt there, we're not motivated to take accountability and to say sorry, to make amends, to take whatever appropriate actions come on the heels of that awareness. So guilt, in my view, isn't something to just release simply, but to allow it to move us through a process. And the I'm so sorry, that might, it really depends on the context. That might mean actually apologizing to a human person. It might be an internal process, right? We might apologize in a spiritual way, soul to soul, being to being. And then with the I'm so sorry can come the release. That's when guilt can be released because it has served its purpose. Now, in order to release the guilt, I think what we need is forgiveness. And forgiveness may come from outside, but most importantly, we must forgive ourselves. So, I'm so sorry. And then do you have it within you to forgive yourself? Even if someone else can't forgive you, right? Even if the person you harmed doesn't forgive you, can you forgive yourself? Right? And the process is necessary. We don't just forgive ourselves, as in I don't need to change anything, I don't need to do anything, I'm forgiven. Forgiveness comes through owning up to what we did, through facing it, through really feeling it, through acknowledging it, through feeling sorry and being sorry and saying sorry. So all that is necessary before we can truly forgive ourselves. And this is one of the highest potentials of Neptune, forgiveness. I don't know that we can change the pattern of even the subtle ways in which we may cause harm unless we can forgive ourselves. I think there's this attitude that if I forgive myself, I might do it again. But actually, it's the opposite. We can't change without the forgiveness. Some of these patterns are so deeply embedded in the soul, for generations, for lifetimes. But they can be healed as we forgive ourselves. And as we forgive ourselves, that opens up a greater possibility to forgive others too. When we acknowledge that we have caused harm, and when we forgive ourselves for that, it opens up the possibility to forgive others who have caused harm. And again, there's often the perception that if I forgive them, I'm letting them off the hook, I'm allowing it. But forgiveness is not allowing. This is really important. A lot of people confuse this. People think if I forgive them, I condone their actions. It's not like that. A perpetrator can only heal if they go through that process I described, if they are willing to do the work of facing themselves, of owning up to what they've done, of apologizing, of forgiving themselves. That needs to happen. for them to heal, for the pattern to be shifted. And we don't take that away from them when we forgive them. To forgive someone is not to say, you're off the hook, you're done, you're healed, you don't need to do anything. But refusing to forgive them unless they move through that process doesn't work either. So forgiveness really is for you, not for them, mostly, right? We can forgive another person for ourselves so that we can find peace with what happened. And it's not to condone it. It's not to encourage their actions. It's not to remove that healing process from them. It's so that we can find peace. And this is not to insist that everyone ought to forgive everyone. Forgiveness is not a process that can be forced or imposed. It may take lifetimes before we're ready to forgive. So forgiveness of ourselves and others can be deeply, deeply, deeply healing. But we can't force it. We have to be ready. And when we are ready, if we have the courage to do it, it's absolutely transformative. Now, don't you think that that kind of difficult, courageous, quiet, individual work has more potential to bring about more peace on earth than calling for more and more acts of violence, even if those acts are called against the perpetrators? So Saturn here with Neptune in Aries adds another element to this. So very different from the energy of Neptune, right, which is diffuse and dissolving and about dissolution and transcendence and acceptance and forgiveness and universal love and delusion and confusion and mysticism. Saturn is about the 3D reality. It's about what we can see and touch. It's very grounded. It's about structure. It's about limitation. It's about realism. It can be difficult lessons. It can be austerity, in the collective. It can very much, with Neptune in Aries, be related to war and violence. But on an individual level, it certainly doesn't need to be that. So the potential is to lean into discipline and effort, and particularly with regards to our spiritual practices, right? That is a beautiful use of Saturn and Neptune together. Spiritual practice and discipline, right? A daily meditation, daily practice, prayer, yoga, whatever it is. Study, deep study, mystical study of texts. And it can also help us to manifest our dreams in reality. So it's like first we're likely to be disillusioned, right? To sort of have our fantasy dream kind of almost fall from grace, to recognize that it's been mere fantasy. But then to do the work of actually bringing it down to reality in a practical, feasible way. So we might first have to be disillusioned, but then Saturn can really help us with the structure, with the discipline, with the realism, with the practicality of actually manifesting the dream in reality. It's going to take work and focus and effort. And yet, these energies give us that motivation. They help us to focus. You can understand particularly what area of your life this relates to by looking at which house Aries falls into in your birth chart. Now, with this shift of Neptune into Aries, and what I haven't spoken to today, Uranus into Gemini and Pluto at the end of 2024 into Aquarius, and Saturn also in Aries, we've got the outer planets moving into masculine signs and out of feminine signs, right? Out of yin and into yang. And for the more sensitive among us, I think we're now being called to act, to be leaders, to be out there in the world just a little bit more, right? So we're very sensitive to these energies. We've been in a more yin state of being for the past few years. We've been a little more quiet, a little less visible. But now is our time, right? It's important to remember that sensitivity is an incredible gift, and that as a group we have a lot to offer the world. And we may not always be natural leaders, but because many of us have spent a lot of time understanding the inner landscape, right, doing inner work, healing, and there's a need for that in the world. And it doesn't need to be stepping into leadership role in a very obvious way, but just sharing our energy, sharing our thoughts, sharing our perspectives with the world in a little bit more active of a way is really called for right now. And many of us will feel that naturally. So it's not to force it, but to ride that wave, right? And to remember that you have a lot to offer the world, the people in your life, and the collective at large. And not, of course, in a way where we're trying to control anyone or trying to insist on our perspective, but just simply in a way of sharing and offering ourselves, right? Contributing in that way. Finally, I want to remind us, and I often need this reminder too, that from the spiritual perspective, we are free. There are very tangible ways in which many people are not free. But we always, at the very least, have the freedom as to how we respond to any situation. And that is really important. We may not be 100% free across the board in a material way. And yet we always have freedom. No matter how dire it gets, there's always some freedom. We always have some choice as to how we respond, as to what action we take, as to what we think, say, believe. And, if we keep in mind that the material, practical level of reality is real, and the spiritual, mystical level of reality is real, on that level, we are completely free. So it's not about escaping this reality and hiding in that one. It's about drawing that awareness from the transcendent realm down into this world so that we can feel a little more free, act a little more free, be a little more free, and manifest that in more material ways. We are free. We just need to remember and embody it and create that freedom for others too. Saturn can work on Neptune in the sense of bringing discernment and the reality principle to bear on our fantasies and our dreams. But Neptune can also operate on Saturn in the sense of dissolving our false limitations, right? Helping us to overcome our limiting beliefs. So much of what we consider to be real limitation is merely belief. It's how we think. It's how we've been thinking for so long, right? Maybe for decades or generations or lifetimes. So that's not to say that there aren't people in the world who are genuinely in very difficult situations that are not of their own doing, right? So keeping some nuance and discernment here is really important. And yet, so many of the ways in which we feel limited, constricted, restricted, trapped aren't actually real. So much of that is in the mind. So, when we set intentions, setting intentions is so powerful. And we don't always need to be very specific. We don't always need to understand in our conscious mind how it all is going to play out. But setting some intentions like, may my limiting beliefs be dissolved, can be very powerful, right? So you don't even necessarily need to know specifically what all those limiting beliefs are. They will be revealed to you if you need to know them, right? And in good time, if you set that intention. May my limiting beliefs be dissolved. May I feel my freedom and embody it and enact it. May I see where I've been delusional and be more realistic in my dream, and yet believe in the dream nonetheless. May I bring my dream into reality. May I be shown the steps to take in order to move towards what is best and highest and truest for me. May I release what is ready to be released. May I forgive where I'm ready to forgive. May I be more realistic where I need to be more realistic. May I be more imaginative where I need to be more imaginative. May I know union with the divine. May I experience the reality beyond this one, while still embodied, while still incarnated. May all beings in all realms be free, know they are free, and experience their freedom. And so it is. Thank you so much for listening. You can find out more about my work at Secret Art of Spacetime or Mystic Sandwich. You're always welcome to reach out to me if you have questions or comments. I'm also, at least at the time of recording, available for one-on-one consultations if you want to go into this more deeply or get a more personal perspective on what's going on with your own astrology, your own energies. The way I work always begins from your questions, your experiences, your challenges. So I don't do general readings. I don't do full birth chart readings. I would prefer to focus in on really what is most relevant and what is most helpful. So I draw in astrology, I draw in tarot, I draw in intuition, I draw in energy work. And I find that this is, at least for me, more effective than trying to give you a general birth chart reading, for instance. Thank you again so much for being here. I'm sending you so much love. Take care. For more information, for more content, head on over to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Until next time, take care.